So I'd like to introduce Michael LaFond, talking tonight about cluster apartments and shared flats in co-housing. And Michael, to be honest, all I really know about you is that you've been involved in co-housing for decades, and you're in Berlin, Germany, and that's about the extent of it. So, so tell us who you are and tell us what you want to tell us tonight.
Okay, Karen, thank you very much for the moderation, for the invitation to give my little spiel here. Yeah, it's exciting for me to be chatting with you and others, I assume, all in the United States. I grew up in the US, but I came to Berlin quite a few years ago. So I've got experiences on both sides of the Atlantic, but my work over the last 2 or 3 decades has been mostly Berlin and Europe. My background is architecture, urban design, and planning. And over the last couple of decades, I've been mostly involved in Berlin and other European cities. I live in a cooperative. I'll be showing a little bit about this place in Berlin. And I direct a nonprofit organization. I think you can see the name on the screen, ID22, the Institute for Creative Sustainability. So yeah, it's become my life and my work and pretty much everything. So for the next, let's say about 15 minutes, I'll be talking about what we're calling cluster apartments and shared flats in co-housing, especially in Berlin. And after that, I'm happy to discuss and see what questions we have. So first, just a couple of things about the organization to give you some background about what I'm doing with my time, or what gives me this background to talk about these projects. This organization, this institute, for the last 15 to 20 years has been working with what we're calling co-housing projects in Berlin and other European cities. We do a lot of networking, communications, research, publications, online platforms, things like this experiment days every year for the last 15 years, where we bring together projects and people looking for projects. We do this platform called Cohousing Berlin for quite a few years now. It's an information platform in the German and English languages, and another way to connect people, organizing projects, people looking for projects. We've got a couple of books, the Co-housing Cultures book, which is about 5 or 6 years old, and the Co-housing Inclusive book, which is about a couple of years old now. And both of these focus on European examples of what we call co-housing. So starting off with the idea of co-housing, what do we mean by that? I think we can all agree that basic inspiration for what we're talking about over there in North America as well as Europe is coming from Scandinavia, especially Denmark and Sweden. The American model, let's call it in general, based on the McCament and Durrett co-housing book at the end of the 80s. Not always, but quite often, relatively low density housing, single family homes, row homes, community centers, and so on. What I'm mainly looking at over here, I'm working with, I'll call it a European model in contrast. And so it's usually higher density multifamily buildings, quite often mixed use projects. And so there's a fairly great diversity what these projects end up looking like. Co-housing, otherwise, I mean, according to myself and people that I work with, it's a fairly broad definition. It's not an academically and clearly defined term, but let's just say in general, we talk about projects that are largely self-organized, so a great degree of participation in the planning and in the building and the managing of the housing. So this means community-led or community-oriented, community-based housing. And we usually like to say it includes some idea of sustainability, talking about long-term housing, perhaps involving in environmental technologies. The general motivations, so why get into co-housing? Probably we can agree with each other on a lot of these motivations. So yeah, avoiding loneliness, search for affordability. That means people don't just have the private space, but have access to gardens and community spaces, and can get more out of their own financing. Positively, yeah, living next to friends, having good neighbors. On the environmental side, saving resources, energy, and stuff. So this means sharing space in a general sense. At another level, social level, we say practicing democracy. So yeah, developing social and communication skills. We'll be coming back to this with the idea of cluster apartments and shared flats. And this is something really coming out of Scandinavia, Denmark, and Sweden. People cooking and eating together. I know this is a part of a lot of American co-housing communities as well. And I think last but not least, maybe the most important thing, yeah, why co-housing is about sharing life and about being human, sharing life with all of its ups and downs. If we just touch on a few things in Berlin, where is this idea of co-housing coming from, and especially the practice of what we're calling shared flats or cluster apartments in English. The history, a very long and strong history of housing cooperatives going way back into the 1860s and 1870s. And so this gives us an economic foundation, meaning typically land and apartments owned by the cooperative, so people buy shares. They collectively manage their apartments. So this economic foundation, from my perspective, is a big support when we're talking about going this path of sharing flats or of clustering. In Berlin and other German cities, we also have this history of what could be called communes, especially out of the 1960s or 70s, or WGs, which is what many young people go through in a phase of their life in a big city like Berlin. Also strong histories of squatted buildings, and coming out of that, what have been called self-help projects, so strong ideas of self-organization and people working together and living together. There's a large number of housing projects that have emerged in Berlin over the last 3 or 4 decades. Again, you know, the word co-housing is a term that's loosely used, so how many of these would be classified as co-housing projects is open for debate. I would argue there's at least 100 of them that could come under that umbrella. I'm going to talk more specifically about a couple of projects to illustrate this. The first one is the one that I've been connected to. We've been living here, working here for the last 5 years, and I was part of the development going back a few years before that. So it's called the Spreefeld. It's in Berlin. The Spreefeld is the name of the neighborhood of the housing cooperative. And the Spree is the name of the cluster apartment group or the shared flat group that I'm living in. This is what the neighborhood looks like during the planning phase. So we've got 3 buildings, multifamily housing. About 150 people live in the neighborhood. About 30% of the housing is in what we would call shared flats or clustered apartments. Just a couple of images from the neighborhood or the general level of the cooperative. So this is an example of a larger community space at the ground level, kind of a space that's available for people that live and work here, but also for people from other parts of the city who want to use a space for an event, for a meeting, maybe a party. That's just an image from the courtyard between the three buildings. So people are living here, they're working here, there's a daycare, these community spaces, workshop spaces, so people are here for a number of different reasons. Working in the gardens as well. If we come back, so let's start to focus on the idea of the clustered apartments. So I'm part of the largest group here. We've got about 23 people who are sharing 2 floors of one of the buildings. So we are a project in the project. We have our own organizational structure, our own little management structure. We were involved in the planning and development phase, which was like 3 years before we moved in. Here we are on the construction side, at least part of our particular group. So we had the opportunity with the architects and the project facilitators to a great extent plan our own spaces, our own private spaces and our own community spaces within our shared flat group. So here we are during the construction phase on one of the floors of our shared living space. I'm just going to show a few more photos to give you an idea of the group. This is just an example of us in this is after we moved in, and it's not even in the place where we live. Every year, once or twice, we go somewhere else for a weekend and have kind of an intensive weekend of discussions and exchanges to check in with each other and find out how things are going and talk about how we can improve the situation among ourselves. So I would say it's an ongoing process of community building or taking care of the community at our micro project level. Cooking and eating together is certainly a big part of our group. I think it is of any, I would say, real co-housing group. Here we are in our community kitchen space. As I say, we've got about 23 people in our particular group. This is our big community kitchen. Upstairs from that, there's a community living room. We have about 12 private spaces which are connected to these community spaces. Maybe it's a bit hard to imagine coming from a lower density co-housing situation, but we have 2 floors of one of the buildings, meaning we're in the 3rd and the 4th floors of one building. Like the kitchen is on the 3rd floor and the living room is on the 4th floor, and we have 6 private spaces on each one of these floors. So yeah, cooking and eating together. This is not what it looks like every evening, but yeah, on a regular basis, we have larger events like this where 20 to 30 people are coming together. I'm going to show just a couple of slides from one more project, and then I'll conclude with the presentation part, and we can start going into your questions. So the project which I just showed is the project I'm living in. I would describe it as a co-housing project for middle-class people, maybe lower middle class to a certain extent. The project which I'm showing you right now to emphasize the idea of inclusion, and this is emphasized in a book called Cohousing Inclusive, where we're exploring co-housing projects, community housing projects, which are, I would say, trying to open themselves up to people with either less money or people that are handicapped or perhaps refugees or other things. So I'm going to show just a little bit from one project in Berlin, which has not been built yet, but has been in the development for the last few years. In German called the Vollgut, or the Alltag, which means really everyday life in a downtown Berlin neighborhood. So it's a project. It's part of an industrial site which is being redeveloped, and for us, it's an example of a co-housing project, which kind of a co-housing project largely being developed without the future residents. So I think probably we agree, usually co-housing means the future residents are involved with architects and developers to plan the future housing. But this is an exploration of a kind of co-housing which is being planned by professionals to give, let's call them housing needs groups or disadvantaged groups, a co-housing experience. And it's a cooperation then with social agencies who help to manage a few different groups who will have the opportunity to move in to this building in the next couple of years. So it's a communicative, cooperative kind of housing where you have people with smaller than usual private spaces, but with shared community spaces, and at the ground level, cafe and other kinds of spaces which open up into a larger public space. So providing opportunities for interaction at the more protected private level, and then going down to the ground level to the larger neighborhood and public. I show this, and again, it's part of the discussion of our book, Cohousing Inclusive, and for me, it's an important part of what I hope is the future of co-housing, meaning exploring how co-housing, how this model of shared housing, including things like shared flats and shared kitchens, can be opened up to larger groups of people. So that's pretty much the presentation. So thanks for your attention so far, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
I have a question, Michael.
Okay.
So in the project that you live in, it's on the 2 different floors,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some shared spaces and private spaces. What is considered a private space, or what does the private space include?
What does it look like? Yeah, maybe it's a good question, and I would answer that by giving a short definition of what we mean here when we say shared flat or when we say cluster apartment. This is also part of our book, Cohousing Inclusive, and cluster apartments, when we say that, we mean these are clusters of complete but smaller than average individual units. So this means people have a small bathroom and a very small kitchen. And then they have access to the community spaces, meaning community living room and a community kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
With the shared flat, what we're really saying is people have private space. That they will usually have their own toilet and a shower, but they will not necessarily have their own kitchen. So, for example, in the group that I'm living in, most of the units do not have their own private kitchen. Most of the units have an option to build a kitchen in at some point, but in most of the spaces it doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist yet. So the emphasis is on sharing the community kitchen, and that's why we would say it's more of a shared flat situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if we look at at my project, I think of the 12 private spaces, about 4 of them have a small kitchen. Most of them have their own toilet, but there's a few which are really nothing more than a room. So it's very affordable for younger people, or situations where you might have a single mother with a couple of children, and one of the children just has a room. And for example, this child can use the shower and the toilet in the mother space, or can use a toilet and a shower in the community space. So there's flexibility there.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
But the principle applies, I think, generally, and I think that's true of co-housing in North America as well as over here, that for the most part, we're talking about smaller than average private spaces, and then putting those resources into the shared community spaces.
Mhm. I think that in the US, what I've been observing is, while that is true for some co-housing communities, it's not for others. I certainly have been to
Mhm.
visit communities where the private homes are, large,
The normal size.
fully
Yeah.
contained homes.
Right.
So I think that's what I've observed, is that it kind of depends on the community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one other thing I could add to that. There's more and more research going on in Berlin and other European cities, which is, I think, a good indication that these projects are being taken seriously and they're being studied, and the government is interested, and universities are interested in what's really going on. And there's some research which is including our project, and it's asking what these kinds of cluster apartments or shared flats are really capable of achieving. So on the one hand, they're asking questions of a social nature, which is like, are people happier? Do they feel community? Does it give them uh, really a sense of community, a place where they feel included? Is it doing that? And then they're asking questions on the environmental side, and that is, to what extent are people actually sharing, no, to what extent are people actually saving on space? So meaning using less space, and to what extent are people using less energy or resources? So I think it's pretty important. These are important questions, if we're interested in sustainability, and I think co-housing can really make a significant contribution to the question of sustainable development in general. And then it's really important to dig a little bit deeper into these projects and see what's going on. And but anyway, that's an argument for cluster apartments and shared flats, that at least theoretically, and I think it's quite often the case, that people in fact are living not just with a good idea of community, but people can actually save resources and in fact share stuff, right? Share washing machines, of course. You can share cars, but you can share a kitchen. You can share other things. So I think these are some interesting developments.
Other questions from people? If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in.
So my question is about the shared kitchen, and it sounds like you have some like organized community meals that somebody cooks presumably for everyone. But I'm wondering what the fact of not having your own private kitchen, and what does it mean then in terms of, do people eat together more often, or do they sort of eat in parallel in the same space more often? What can you say about the impact of not having your own kitchen?
Yeah, it's a good question, and You know, the thing about cooking and eating together on a regular basis, it's not really it doesn't really have a strong Berlin or German tradition either. That's why in the beginning I said the influences are coming from Scandinavia, where that's a wider practice. And I think that's how it got over to the U.S. as well, as you know, looking at Denmark. But it's becoming what do we say? It's the idea has been introduced into Berlin. I mean, we're part of this new movement. The way I look at it is, it's good for people to have the option, and that's a question of affordability. I mean, the idea of the cluster apartment, of course, is more expensive than just having a shared flat if everybody has their own small kitchen. I mean, that's more like maybe co-housing in the US. People have the option to go to the community building to get their dinner, or they can cook and eat at home. So then you've got multiple kitchens, right? But I think, or my guess is that most people would like to have that option so they don't feel like they're forced to, you know, every morning and every evening sit down with a bunch of people at the table. The way we can see it working in our place, and we've been here for 5 years now, is that, well, people come and go differently. So first of all, not everybody's there all the time. In the morning, it's different than the evening. We're different from some co-housing groups in the US and in Scandinavia, meaning we don't have a regular cooking plan or cooking teams, meaning like, you know, on Tuesday evening you're cooking and on Wednesday evening I'm cooking, but rather it's kept more flexible. So that means we have a board in the kitchen, like a chalkboard, and people can announce that they're cooking, you know, either tomorrow or in the next week on a particular evening. So like I can say on Thursday evening, Michael is cooking, it's going to be Mexican food at 7 p.m. And people are invited to sign up. So I would know if I'm cooking for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 people. So that's a part of it. Every evening, somebody's cooking in the community kitchen. So that's the nice thing about it, is that you can come home in the evening and there will always be food there. So somebody is cooking either a smaller amount or a large amount of food. Sometimes it works out that people are cooking and eating next to each other for different reasons. People have something special they want to cook and eat, or maybe they've invited some friends over and they want to sit down with those people. But for the most part, if somebody's cooking there in the community space, then it's kind of an open invitation. If somebody else comes in, then it's expected that that food would be shared. But it's a flexible approach, and it seems to work. Yeah. So I guess my conclusion is that there is really not one approach that works everywhere. I think with some co-housing groups, the best thing is a regular cooking plan, probably with larger groups and where people are living in their own home. Maybe you need more structure and advance notice. And this kind of a shared flat where we're living closer to each other, it seems to work with less structure. But no question about it, the cooking and eating together is really the most important part of the community living, and the kitchen is the heart of the project. That's where, you know, people go to talk with others, hang out, drink tea, coffee, run into others, and yeah, that's really the special community place at the kitchen table.
Michael, somebody had a question about, so your project is those 2 floors, about 20 people, I think you said, but then it's a larger building, right?
Yeah.
So the other floors and units, are they just kind of standard individual flats, and is there is there interaction between the different projects within the project?
It's a good question. I didn't really touch on that, but yeah, so you can look at this as the larger project, so the whole neighborhood, 3 buildings, about 150 people, another 70 or 80 people who are working there on a daily basis, the daycare where kids are coming and going, and community space where people come and go in, and these gardens and so on, where a public is moving through. So that's like an urban neighborhood, and it's organized as a cooperative structure. It has its own questions. We have monthly meetings. We have issues, right, at the larger level, and how to do, things that relate to the neighborhood, or financial questions that relate to the whole project. And then we've got like I say, about 30% of the apartments are these shared flats or cluster apartments like mine. So again, we describe our smaller things as projects in the project. I think one important way to look at it is the community is possible in different ways at these different scales or different levels. And at the scale of the neighborhood, you have a kind of a community, but it's a looser community. It's like a neighborhood or like a village. People know each other. They do things together. They see each other, but it's not a tight community. And if you get down to these smaller projects like the one that I'm living in, it's a stronger version of communities. People are cooking and eating together. People definitely know each other in a more personal way. It's still not a family, but it's something more than just a neighborhood. These are really, it's somewhere between friendship and family, where people are sharing more. I mean, seeing each other more often, sharing more of their lives. So I think it's, well, I can say for myself, it's an interesting situation to have these different levels, possibilities for engagement. I talk a lot about democracy, and at the level of the cluster groups of the shared flats, it's very much a direct democracy. So all of the adults are very much involved in the decision making. We have our own monthly meetings, and at the level of the larger neighborhood, it's somewhere closer to a representative democracy, and again, it's not as tight. You don't have to like everybody in the neighborhood, and certainly don't have to be friends with everybody in the neighborhood. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see that a project, like a larger project like this, can allow for some different things to go on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Other questions from you all?
I'll ask another question. Sorry,
Yeah.
I have a bunch of questions. So it sounds like the most recent project that you're working on, which is for, it sounds like serving some economic diverse folks. The one that you're creating it, yet you don't have the people yet. Sounds similar to what we would call here developer driven.
Mm-hmm.
And and I'm just curious, so what if anything are you all doing to kind of what am I trying to say? How can you encourage those relationships, since people are not coming together to create it? It's being the physical structures are being created, and then the people will come.
Right.
What is your kind of plan, so to speak, to connect them?
Um, yeah, it's a really good question, and you know, I would say we're learning and experimenting a bit, and we can hopefully guess how things will work. But I would say, well, to take one step back to think about or to reflect on what co-housing or these kinds of self-organized housing projects have usually meant, and I think it's true in Europe as well as in the US, is that we're typically thinking about groups of people that are brought together or that organize themselves with architects and developers to create their own housing. So people are involved in the planning and the construction and later in the management. But if you think about it over the long term, then, after the second generation, let's say after 20 or 25 years, then, the next generation won't have the opportunity to actually design the housing, but people move into it. So at some point, it crosses some border, like, people are moving into housing that they didn't create, it's created by other people and architects. And so if we're thinking about co-housing for the long term, then I think it's one of the questions. So the emphasis is more on the residing or the dwelling and less on the building.
Mm-hmm.
Because so many co-housing projects are new in North America, and also over here, we have an obsession with the building and the planning and so on. But I think not enough attention has gone into the residential phase. So what happens with these people are, and then asking the question, okay, to what extent can professionals actually plan without the future residents? And I would say it's always better, if possible, to include the future residents, because I think that brings in special qualities. But for questions of affordability, and if we're talking about disadvantaged groups, or when it sometimes includes things like assisted living, it can be seniors, it can be I don't know what, then I think it's probably, I think it can work out that architects working with social agencies and housing experts can plan for an architecture and include spaces that will allow, something like co-housing to work. It's going to take, whereas co-housing, as we know it, and you know it in the U.S., it's a pretty intense process of facilitating. So architects, developers working with future residents, getting out of these people what they want, and then figuring out what's possible. In the case of this, use the word developer-driven. A different kind of moderation or facilitation will have to go on after people have moved in. So whatever we call that, so community managers, community developers, facilitators, moderators, will have to do some work to help to build a community, help to introduce people to this idea. If people are dropped into these community spaces, then I think we would all agree that people need some kind of introduction and some kind of well, introduction is the word. So it's not like if people have no experience with community living, then it's hard for them to use community spaces, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if people are using a community kitchen, there might be a process of figuring that out and developing some rules and agreed on strategies. Yeah, maybe. I mean, one other thing I could say about the project. Well, no, I'll let you ask your question, so I won't go on talking.
Hi, this is Tom Brayford. I'm joined from St. Louis, Missouri. I apologize. I had something come up and I came on late, about 18 minutes in, so you might have already covered this, but have you combined the flat sharing or some of these other approaches with the co-housing model. So having a section of the building that's more focused on shorter term, lower cost rentals.
Yeah, that's we're approximating that in the project that I presented. Well, the one where I'm living and working, called the Sprayfield. Just to summarize that, we've got about 150 people living here. That's about 65 units, and about 30% of these are what we call cluster apartments or shared flats. So in these three buildings or in this neighborhood, we do have a combination of people living with a stronger version of community, meaning sharing a kitchen, and people living with contained or let's say complete apartments, normal apartments, where they have access to community spaces, but where people are not looking for the same degree of community, I guess we would say. So this is part of our project, and this idea or this approach, it has been realized in a few other projects, and in a number of projects that are being developed. And in Berlin and a few other European cities, we can see this emerging. So it's definitely something that's on the increase.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be a definite interest for a few different reasons. One of them is affordability, where people can have a smaller space, maybe it doesn't even have a kitchen, so obviously that reduces the costs. And other people are interested in this stronger idea of community, so they say, okay, I'm happy to share a kitchen with people. So it's, people coming at it from different backgrounds, but yeah, it's something that's happening in different projects, and it does seem to be on the increase. We even have city housing companies in Berlin who are starting to build housing for the larger public, which includes combinations of let's call them normal apartments in a building, and things like cluster apartments. At that official level, these companies are exploring that now.
Well, thank you. Are you part of, or do you know of the Medici co-living group?
In fact, I was at I'm not part of it, but I was at a small conference a couple of weeks ago where people from the Medici company were presenting their strategies. If I have to be honest, then I would have to say that I'm quite skeptical, or actually quite critical of some of the projects that are being developed, and I can't say that I know everything that group is doing, but I'm talking about co-housing with my projects. They tend to use the term co-living, and I don't know if we want to really go into that in detail, but I would use the word skeptical and critical of that approach. It's I would summarize it as saying it's a profit-driven model, which is well, I don't want to be mean, but interested in maximizing profit from particular buildings, meaning people are paying a relatively large amount of money for a very small private unit, and then they are given some community spaces to share, and the developers are able to make more money by renting out small spaces because the word is put in front of it. So that's my critical view of it.
All right. So, well, I got a similar impression when I first heard about it. The only thing I was wondering is if they are providing some services in terms of, I mean, they talk about amenity-rich environments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you know, are they doing things that assist people in living cooperatively, or in providing facilities or training or anything that would have it be more of a community experience?
Well, it's really interesting that you asked the question. And like I said, I was at this conference a couple of weeks ago, and I've spent a bit of time looking into it because it seems to be on the rise in Berlin, and especially in larger cities in the U.S. like New York, Los Angeles, London, Berlin, Barcelona, and so on. What seems to be going on, and again, I am not an expert on co-living. I'm just giving you my impression of what I know. It's focused on what are called the digital nomads. So we're talking about people who are 30, 40 years old, maybe even 25, up to 45, but these are people who are really nomadic. That means either by choice or because they're forced to because of their particular work, that they're traveling around from city to city. Maybe they're part of startups or they're part of companies where they're getting the training, and they're in a city for only 6 months or a year. That means they can't get into any kind of permanent housing. And if they were just to find their own apartment, pay a lot of money, then they would be lonely. They wouldn't have contacts with other people in the city. So from that perspective, I would say co-living is addressing a need, right? I mean that's a good thing. That there's an interest in having neighbors and meeting people and finding something like community. But what does it look like in the particular buildings? You've got, again, like micro apartments, and there's something like a community kitchen, maybe a roof terrace, a party room, and they'll have a kind of a building manager, a community manager, who has the job to organize events, to sort of animate and encourage people to get involved. So, I mean, on the positive side, I say, yeah, the co-living, it is addressing a need, and, people are looking for community at different phases in their lives, and for people who really are nomadic, or especially younger people, it's pretty hard for them to find a place in a co-housing project because they're not ready to settle down. They don't have that much money. So the question for co-housing is, how in any way do we reach out to people, younger people, people who are mobile, or people who have less money? So I think, in fact, it's a weakness of co-housing, and co-living is picking up on that. But again, my irritation is that whereas I want to look at co-housing not as a profit model, but as something that it's giving people community. It's part of a sustainability movement. I see co-living coming at it from a whole other point, which is, I think, catching people off guard and at the worst, abusing the co-term. Another long answer to your question, but
okay. Oh, that's very good. It reflects some of my own thinking. The one thing that I see, because we're developing an eco-village in St. Louis it'll be four contiguous co-housing neighborhoods. And fortunately, we got some big state tax credits that'll let us do for sale housing and be able to sell it for basically what it cost us to build them.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been a lot of people that have approached us and they say, well, you know, aren't you planning on having any rentals? You know, we would like to try this out for a while, but we don't know if we really want to or are in a position to go ahead and purchase.
Right.
And so we looked at maybe the possibility of doing one of our neighborhoods as a co-living neighborhood. And then one of the advantages of the Medici model is that you have somebody that will do a master lease and manage that and keep those units filled. And at the same time, that would provide us an opportunity for people that are either have sold their houses in anticipation of moving into co-housing and not wanting to sign a year lease somewhere, be able to plug into community right now. Maybe people that are nomadic at this stage in their life but want to be able to settle down, and having that in the context of an eco-village where you've got three very stable co-housing neighborhoods. We thought, you know, this might just add another feature that would be make the overall eco-village work better.
Right. No, I think it's an interesting challenge to open up co-housing to other let's call them target groups. So people that are more mobile, people that have less money, and so on. And that's a question that we asked ourselves with the Sprayfield project where I am. Initially, we wanted to have 20% rental as part of the larger neighborhood. You know, the usual question came up, well, you know, somebody has to pay for it, and, you know, who's paying for it? And if you don't have a government fund, you know, subsidy program or some other foundation, then that means that the individuals who move in have to pay for it. So that's usually not going to be possible. But so, I mean, if I think about your situation there, where you've got this larger eco-village with a few different blocks, or let's say 3 sub-projects, you know, you say 2 of them would be more like co-housing, the other one could be co-living. You know, it's hard to say, you know, from a distance and not knowing enough about it to really make any conclusive statement. I mean, I would just say from what I know about our options in Berlin or in European cities is that, I mean, I come back to the point that I want to see co-housing in an not a purely idealistic world, but in as a part of a sustainability movement, which means addressing questions of affordability. And so we're more interested in the nonprofit approach, or at least in a non-speculative approach. And for us, this really means we're looking for partners. These can be housing cooperatives, they can be city housing companies, they can be social agencies, nonprofit companies that are in a position to build or manage housing. So that's just my initial spontaneous reaction that we would definitely be looking for partners that would be somehow capable and interested in managing housing, again, with a nonprofit approach. That's my big criticism of the Medici Group, is that I think that leads to other conflicts, and I'm not sure what that means after the first years. Where does it go after the Medici Group has been managing it? Is that a long-term solution? I don't know.
Well, one other thing that we looked at that made it sound like maybe it would be worthwhile to explore further is that my understanding with Medici, and I don't know how some of the other groups that are evolving on the coast are doing it, but they typically do a 10-year master lease, and that would mean that after 10 years, after the other co-housing communities have had a long time to get fully established, and there's likely to be demand but no openings, that then there would be an opportunity to convert that to co-housing at that point.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I certainly wouldn't want to rule that out, and I know from looking at a number of Berlin and European projects, we find surprising combinations. For example, a housing cooperative is combined or paired up with a condominium model. So you have kind of a cross financing or kind of a cross subsidy to make it work. So I think, the reality of housing development and management seems to to demand that of us, a certain amount of flexibility, if we're really going to be developing larger amounts of housing. And if the government subsidies are really not there, which there usually are not, for a lot of housing, then yeah, I could understand going that way, at least for a short period of time, to make the housing happen, and then they have the option to examine that after 10 years and think how the complete neighborhood could continue to emerge, to grow. Yeah. So
well, we started looking at some of these other models because people from the National Co-op Bank come to our co-housing conferences and say they're interested in financing cooperative housing, but outside of a very limited market on the coast, they don't really seem to be willing to do that within the context of co-housing. Say, we've designed in 5 and 6 bedroom homes that we thought would be ideal for co-op housing, sort of a shared flat concept to start with, but thinking of it as co-op housing, still a ownership model, just on a smaller, more affordable entry scale, but actually being able to put the financing together for that hasn't seemed to really be a reality.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. For the most part, when we talk about co-housing over here, we're also talking about private initiatives. These are groups of people who come together with architects and developers to make things happen, largely with their own resources. And if you're talking about rental housing, then that's usually going beyond those resources. So we're lucky in some cases that the government is interested. In some cases, well, we've got different banks and foundations who are quite interested in cooperative housing or things like cohousing. But yeah, same thing here. We've got interesting combinations of ownership, different ownership models. That's fine, as long as things are clear and there's some kind of a long-term vision there. I think, yeah. I mean, you know, I like to be idealistic, and I think it's good to have a sustainable long-term vision, and then at the same time be realistic, and to definitely understand what's possible, and that's going to be different in every city, and you know, every decade it changes too, according to the funding possibilities and where people are. So.
All right, well, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. And just, even though there's just a few of us still on, I'm going to still do my regular spiel. Michael, thank you so much. And let's see, you're on the international panel, I think, for the Portland conference.
Exactly. I think there's 2 international panels. Anyway, I'm on one of those on the Saturday, I guess.
Yeah, so that'll be fun to kind of hear. It's interesting to hear how it works or is structured in different parts of the world. So that'll be good.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I did plug in the chat here a few things. These web chats are a free offering by Coho US, but we are a nonprofit and function by way of fundraising. So if anybody wants to donate to Coho US, you can through the website, and I plugged in the link into the chat. Also, National Open House Day is coming up on Saturday, April 27th this year. Also in the chat and on the website. So the information about the that day, as well as the list of participating communities. I think we're up to nearly 60 communities are opening their doors throughout the U.S. for people to come and visit, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And then again, the National Co-Housing Conference coming up in Portland, Oregon. So pre-conference intensives and tours offered on May 30th and 31st, and then the main conference sessions and such on Saturday and Sunday, June 1st and 2nd. And then as far as further episodes, do you call them episodes of web chats coming up, available on the website. I plugged the schedule into the chat, or the link into the chat. And the next one is Wednesday, April 7th, 5 p.m. Pacific. We Can Work It Out. We'll be doing a talk about 5 critical elements of a comprehensive and engaging new member orientation. Whew.
Oh, great.
That's a mouthful. So
and my understanding is that is relevant to both forming groups and people who've been around and wanting to orient new members coming in to an existing community.
Great. So Michael, thank you so much. And it's got to be like, what, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning when you are?
It's about 1:10, yeah. So,
Whoa.
So go to bed. Thank you. And we'll see you in 48 days or so.
Yeah, thank you, Karen and Karen, for setting this up. It's been a pleasure for me, an interesting experience to be chatting across the Atlantic. And I definitely look forward to talking with a bunch of you in Portland in 48 days. Yeah.